I've got some thoughts that I've had for a long time, and I've thought a lot about, and I've started several times to actually preach this particular lesson and have not done it. But the reason this comes up in my mind, that questions that science cannot answer, is because I know that all of you over the last 2 years have probably heard people say, follow the science, just over and over and over again. But what you'll notice is when people say follow the science, that you have people on both sides of an issue, and both of those people are saying follow the science. And since that being true, it kind of tells you that science is really not the end-all, be-all to all things. This morning we talked a little bit about, in Bible class I believe, secular humanism, which I mention pretty often. And the reason I do is pretty simple. If you look at our nation, I don't usually talk about the world, because while I watch the news, I don't live in other countries, I live here. I know a little about this nation. I don't know a great deal about others. But in our nation, there has been a great, great, great decline. And I'm not certain exactly when the decline started, but I do know this, that I looked at some of the most recent census material, and what I discovered is from the census in 1970 until the census in 2020, that those people who claim to be a member of some religious organization, now that's not any distinction between which ones might be false religions and which one might be true. That's not really what we're doing. We're just talking about people who claim that they are a member of any religious organization. That percentage has fallen, depending on who you listen to, about 30 to 40%. Now that's a big, big drop of people who just really don't have any concept of God at all. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we have a lot of people who have embraced, though they may not recognize the term, they may not claim that they are a secular humanist. But if you think about it, the word secular humanist is not a name, it's a descriptive phrase. Secular is the opposite of spiritual. And so therefore, there are people who are not spiritually minded. They are secular in their thinking. Humanists are the opposite of theist. A theist is a person who believes that God is in control. A humanist believes that there is no God, and therefore, looking at the animal kingdom as they perceive it, at the top of that chain would be the human animal. And therefore, their idea is that's the greatest intellect in existence, would be the intellect of the human being. And so secular humanism is simply the idea that man can really just kind of take care of himself, and he can paddle his own canoe, and he can answer basically any question you want to answer, which is, I'm not sure what the best expression to use to describe that, but maybe the most charitable one is to say it's total foolishness. It's just not true, and it's pretty easy to see. And so I've been thinking about just looking at a few questions that are pretty, the questions are very important, that scientists can't answer, because science doesn't have the answer for that. But before we do that, I think one of the problems is that sometimes false teachers, whether they're secular humanists or whatever, really don't like to define terms, and they don't like to look at what's going to be our standard of authority in any discussion. For example, if you talk with a person that's a member of a false religion who's not really interested in what the scriptures say, and you say, well, what's going to be our standard of authority? And you say that if it's not in this book, I won't accept it, then they're not really thrilled about that. They want to be in the realm of where they can kind of interject their own feelings into their religion. Well, secular humanists are kind of like that too. They want to kind of redefine science. You know, science is what science is. And we need to understand what it is. And don't let people confuse us by claiming something is scientific when it's not scientific. So let's think about that a little bit. You know, science, by definition, because a lot of people don't realize that words have meanings. Science is a word that literally, if it were to be defined, science simply means knowledge. That's what it means. And so knowledge is something that's incontrovertible. There's no discussion about it. It's just there. I mean, if it's water freezes 32 degrees Fahrenheit, we know that. And that's just an incontrovertible fact. And we can like to think it would freeze at 40, but that's not true. That's not scientific. And us saying it's so doesn't make it so. Science is something that is just is knowledge. And science is something that can only deal with things that can either be observed and or duplicated. In other words, it's not to deal with some thing out here that we really can't observe or duplicate it. Just use an example. You look at the weather, and you probably hear all the time when you watch a weather forecast that they talk about weather models. You hear that constantly. And these are scientists, supposedly. They're meteorologists who are scientists. And they're predicting the weather by looking at weather models. But what you don't see all the time, and once in a while you do see, you see that, and one of the ones that I see it more often than any would be old Leland Statham. There are really three models that are sometimes used. There's our one model, and then there's a European model, and then there's another. There's a third, and I can't remember. But anyway, and when you look at a map, and each one of those models is trying to predict what the weather's going to be this week, they will not be the same. They will be different. That means that's not really a science. That's really not. That's not a science. Now, if years ago, Bill Hall, old-time weatherman, he used to say on his weather prediction forecast, he would say the only way to really predict the weather, the scientific method is stick your head out the window. If it's wet, it's raining. If it's dry, it's not. That's pretty scientific. But looking at a model of what we think might be, that's not scientific. And we need to understand that. But we have a world of people who are trying to sell us on the idea that we as human beings can figure everything out when that's just total foolishness. It's not true. We can't, if something can't be observed and we can't duplicate it by experimentation, then it's really not in the realm for a scientist to be dealing with it. And he really needs to leave that alone. But scientists don't like that. And a lot of people don't realize it, but you probably have heard over the years people talk about the Church of Scientology. That really is a secular humanist organization. That's what it is. It's kind of formalized it into a formal religion where man just knows everything. Well, man knows very little when you get right down to the bottom line. Now let's think about this a little bit. How often do you hear people talk about things and they're mentioning scientific theories? You know, in truth, there are no scientific theories. That's not true. There are no scientific theories. Science is one thing that can be observed and duplicated. Theories are a different thing entirely. Perhaps the two areas that you hear most often in this particular discussion would be people talk about the theory of evolution and the theory of origins. And those are the two times that you hear this a lot. You know what a theory is? A theory is what your opinion is. That's what a theory is. And so that's what a theory is. And what a theory is in the scientific community, what a theory really is, it is a starting point for us to either observe or duplicate something we wish to prove from a scientific perspective. Now, ask the question, is the theory of evolution proven to be factual? And the answer to that is no, positively not. And yet we have decided in the educational system of our country to eliminate any teaching as to how the animal kingdom that we are now seeing, including man in their opinion, has come into existence, and that we're going to take the theory of evolution and we're going to teach that as fact. But that's total foolishness, because it's not fact. It's not something that is established. Who has ever seen an evolutionary process? I mean, actually observed it, where one kind of animal or plant changed into another kind of... Nobody. What laboratory has ever been able to reproduce that in a laboratory so that we can then observe it in a laboratory setting, though we couldn't observe it in a natural setting? And the answer again is never. It has never occurred, ever. And so we're talking about a theory. So anytime you hear the word theory, you can just throw that out and say that's not a part of this discussion, because that's not science. That's what we would like to work on, but that's not science. That hadn't actually been proven by observation or experimentation yet. Let me tell you something that you need to realize. We need to realize, and we need to insist to people, anything that does not meet that criteria, doesn't follow those rules, it's not scientific. If you can't observe it or duplicate it, then it's not scientific. If it's just a theory, then we need to be honest and say that's what it is. This is my theory. This is my opinion. This is the way I believe it is. But I hadn't proved it yet by either observation or experimentation. Now, what Paul said to Timothy is this. He's talking about religious things in general. And he said, "O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust." And then he said this, "Avoid profane and vain babblings." Now, vain babblings would be people saying things that are their opinion and insisting that they're true when they have not been proven. That's a vain babbling, because that's a useless observation that serves no purpose. And then Paul goes on to call it oppositions of science, falsely so called. How many times do you hear people say today, and you even read books about it, the war between science and religion? You hear newscasters talk about the opposition of scientists and people of faith. Well, in truth, there's really not. If there's anything that someone can demonstrate to me that I can observe and understand that this is factual information, I don't have any problem with it. I know it to be true. In other words, a lot of the research that's been done with the virus, for example, that's led to the vaccine, well, they actually researched it. They put things in the virus and they saw what happened. That's scientific. So I don't have any problem. I'm not going to object to that. Now, the interpretation of that factual information and what it actually means in a real world setting is a different story. But actual facts, I don't dispute those. I'm going to tell you something. Science and religion are not at odds with one another. Never have been. Not true religion. But they both have to respect their position and what they're capable of doing. The problem is that when we get to the area where we, as a person of faith, are going to try to deal with scientific experimentation, I don't have the education level to do that. I'm not in that position. But in the same realm, when a scientist begins to try to get involved in the spiritual world, he's not qualified in that area either. Because those are two different issues. Those are two different things. Now, if you don't believe that, I tried to put together a list of things that are pretty obvious. I didn't want to get too vague and too out there in left field. I just want to look at some questions and just have you to ask them, and I want you to think about them. Number one, all the time you hear these ideas about, what is the number one thing we think we're going to accomplish by this latest, most highly developed camera that we just sent into space? I saw the number of billions of dollars it costs. I don't remember what it was. I don't really object to it. I'm kind of curious too. I like to see all that. That's fine. But I know one thing. that's not going to give us the answer of the origin of the universe. It will not. Because from a scientific viewpoint. That may give us some hints, maybe. In fact, we've had a lot of them. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But it can't answer the question for you. You know why? Science is something that demands that you're talking about something that can be observed and or duplicated. We've talked a lot about what's revealed in Job 38. I've even had lessons where I just talked about Job 38. It is such an interesting chapter because it asks a lot of questions. But this one is just really pertinent because it is the way God begins His discussion with Job in this particular chapter. When God is trying to demonstrate to Job the limitations of man, what our limitations are. In other words, what can science do and what can science not do? Here's what God said. First off, He said, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge?" In other words, science. Science not on your side. "Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me." And then He said in verse 4, "Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Now, if you want to talk about origins from a scientific viewpoint, you ever thought about when you go to court in modern times, in modern crime investigation, what is the most important tool that any policeman has investigating a crime today? If you watch any police show that's modern, that's being filmed now, and I watch a lot of the First 48, trying to solve murders. Do you know that the first thing they always do in every case is they get in the car and they ride down the street or they walk down the sidewalk and they look at every house and every business. You know what they're looking for? They're looking for a camera. When you saw this trial that happened up in Wisconsin that was so televised the whole thing. What was it that really made the difference in that trial? Had a videotape. That's scientific evidence. That you observe. You saw it. You know what happened. Somebody trying to tell you what you think you saw doesn't go very far when you're looking at it. You see it. And that's what God said to Job. He said, now, when you get involved in all this conversation about origins, I saw a panel discussion one night. It had Stephen Hawking and a bunch of guys in it. Some were religionists. I think Billy Graham was actually involved in that. And then had a lot of people who were atheists, and they were having this discussion about origins and going to try to decide. Well, let me tell you something. Even I know this. I know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, as stated in Genesis 1:1. Now, if you ask me for any information about the specifics of that, I don't have a clue because I wasn't there and I didn't see it. Anytime you're discussing origins, then you're in a position that you really can't deal with that because it doesn't happen over and over and over and over again. And you didn't see it the first time, and you can't duplicate it, so you're not going to see it. So in the end, you end up with a theory, a hypothesis, an opinion, but you don't have scientific fact. It's just not there. And scientists can't do that. They can't deal with it because it's not in an area within which they can deal. So when folks start talking about what's the answer that science is going to give us the beginning of all things, the answer will be a big fat goose egg. Because from a scientific viewpoint, it's not in their wheelhouse. Now, they can look at all kinds of evidence and reach conclusions as to what they think might have happened. But let me ask you this question. How many times in the last several years, and they had a latest example not long ago from a person in Memphis, I believe, was convicted in Memphis of a crime, of a murder. A rape and a murder. But you know what happened? They kept all of the things that they had used as evidence at the time. They re-examined it now. Now we have DNA. That's a whole lot different. DNA is not reaching conclusions. It's concrete. And so the guy's released from prison because he didn't do it. It just shows us how we can reach wrong conclusions. And we can think things happened when they didn't because we don't have the scientific evidence before us. And that scientific evidence is something that can be observed and duplicated and are duplicated. And we don't have it. So God's asking the question. Why are you trying to answer a question when you weren't there? And so from a scientific viewpoint, and it only happened once, how are you going to answer it? The answer is you can't. When scientists come out and try to tell you how the earth and the universe in which we live came into existence, they don't have any idea. None. Now let's think about this a little bit. Answer this question. You think about it. What is life? Now, I've said before, I've seen a few people die in my lifetime. I mean, been present when they died. I've watched them die. And it's pretty obvious when life leaves their body. But if I'm going to quantify that and give you a definition of life from a scientific viewpoint, I'd like to see a scientific answer to that because I don't believe it's possible. I don't believe it's really possible. And we can give a lot of ideas, but life is an indefinable quality almost when you stop and you think about it. It's kind of interesting to look back to Genesis chapter 3 and verse 7. And I'd kind of like to, or chapter 2 and verse 7 rather, I'd kind of like to know what a secular humanist would tell me about what life is. I'd like to hear that answer because I think he'd kind of have to scratch his head and say, I don't know. In this case, it said the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground, breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And man became a living soul. In other words, he possessed life. He didn't before, he does now. What is it? I'd like to hear that definition. Now, I've heard all the definitions about the blood transferring oxygen and all this kind of thing and the nutrients that come and all that. And I understand all that, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about life. Define it. Can you do that? Well, I can't. Now, if I ask God, can God define it? Sure. But man doesn't have that capability. And we have scientists always talking about things and they're trying to sell you on the idea that they have all the answers, but they don't. They don't have some of the most basic answers. In John chapter 1 and verse 4, if you wonder how life was transferred and what life is, you may not understand that at all. But you are told that God is in possession of such knowledge. Why? Because according to this particular passage, when you're talking about life, it says this. In Him, that's God, was life. And the life was the light of men. God knows what it is. Ask a man to define it. Nah, you're going to get a lot of answers, but they're all theories, conjectures, hypotheses, opinions. What is life? It'll be interesting. And then we think about this. This is to me one of the things that I'd really like a secular humanist to answer me. Why does man have a sense of right and wrong? Now, we've talked about this a lot over the years. Animals really don't have a sense of right and wrong in the sense that things that are moral. They have instinctive behavior. They don't have any idea about right and wrong. I mean, if you see two animals and one of them's eating and the other wants, he just takes it. He doesn't represent property rights. This idea of don't covet what your neighbor's, he doesn't have any idea about that. That's not in his wheelhouse at all. I'd like for a scientist to tell me why. How is it that man has a sense of right and wrong? Now, people always try to tell you that, hey, it's because of this idea of religion. But even religion, for a man to comprehend that or even think of that is a little far-fetched. But I'll tell you something that Paul wrote in Romans 2 that's really interesting. He was talking about the law of Moses and how the Jews were governed by it. And then he turned to the Gentiles and he said this. When the Gentiles, which have not the law, God hadn't revealed the law to them, do by nature. Now that word nature is an interesting word. And it really is kind of hard to define sometimes, but it means what is inherently there. It said these people do by nature the things contained in the law. In other words, if you go to societies in which you don't have the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not commit murder, does just everybody in the whole community think you can just kill whoever you want to? No. Why? In the animal kingdom, they don't have a problem with that. The animals, that's not a problem with them. There's no sense of right and wrong. But in man, there is a sense of right and wrong. Why? It'd be interesting for a scientist to try to answer that. And he would almost have to. If he's going to tell me that I believe in secular humanism, I don't believe there's a God, I believe man is the highest intellect there is, and I know that man is distinctly different than any of the rest of the animal creation, but he can't use the word creation, any of the rest of the animal kingdom, for lack of a better term. I want to know why man has an instinctive idea of what's right and wrong. Why? It goes on to say, their conscience also bearing witness, the fact that man has a conscience, their thoughts the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. He kind of explains it to you there. But he asked that question. He said, you know, the Gentiles don't have the revealed law. They don't have any revealed religion from God, but they do by nature the things contained in the law, and the fact they have a conscience, and the facts that they try to excuse or accuse other people of wrongdoing tells you that they know there is a sense of right and wrong. Tell me, if there is no God, as so many say, if science has the answers, and science is the highest authority to govern in the affairs of men, then how do we end up with that? Something that people don't think about a lot in our country. Our founding fathers said that we have certain inalienable rights given us by whom? Wasn't given us by a secular humanist who was a smart guy and who knew what was right and what was wrong. It was given us by God. Now you think about that and you understand this principle. Can a scientist answer that question? Well, the fact he can't answer the question kind of tells me that man's not the highest intellect in existence. He just is not, because there's intellect higher than him demanded to be able to answer these questions. And then you come up with this thing, and it's kind of interesting too. Where does the instincts that govern animal behavior come from? Now, the secular humanists will tell you that the evolutionary process it brought about all this. But let's think about it. Let's think about that for a moment. You know, evolution is kind of based on the idea of the survival of the fittest. And you kind of go back and you look and you think. When you look at all those salmon that go back to the place of their birth, they don't have a GPS. And you wonder how they do that. How do they do that? Do you think a scientist can really answer you how that instinctive process? They'll say, oh, it happened by evolution. They just tried to do it, and then eventually through so many trials and errors, they finally caught. That's just foolishness. And common sense tell you that's not so. It's kind of like I've used the illustration before when you think about evolution. Put the numbers 1 through 10 in your pocket, printed on pennies. Pull them out in order 1 through 10, and every time you fail and it doesn't come out in that order, you put them all back in your pocket and mix them up again and keep doing that and see how long it'll take you for that to happen. Just 1 through 10, not considering millions and billions of things would have to fall into place. So a scientist would come a long way. You know, let me read you something else God said in the book of Job, and it's really interesting to think about it. Some people may think, oh, you're wasting time with this, but I think we need to challenge this idea of secular humanism. We need to tell people, you know, man doesn't have all the answers. He's not capable. Following the science is sometimes like following the blind, leading the blind. And you have to be really careful. In the 39th chapter of the book of Job, again, in verse 5 and 6, he said this, and it's an interesting thought. He asked directly, who has sent out the wild ass free? Think about that. All the wild animals in the world, the instincts that govern them. According to our scientists, they didn't even, the man, the most intelligent thing that ever existed, didn't even exist when these things were developed. So he didn't have anything to do with it. So who did? It's an interesting question. Who sent out the wild ass free? And he said, who hath loosed the bands of the wild ass? Whose house I have made the wilderness, and the barren land is dwelling. He scorneth the multitude of the city, neither regardeth the crying of the driver. In other words, he does whatever he pleases. How's he do that? How's he survive? Who put him in that position? And if you look down to verse 19 through 27, it's really interesting again. He says this. Talking about the horse. Hast thou given the horse strength? Talking about man. Did we do that? Hast thou closed his neck with thunder? Canst thou make him afraid as a grasshopper? You think about horses and all the instinctive jitteriness they have. Did we train them? Where did it come from? How did it get there? And he goes on in this passage and he says, the glory of his nostrils is terrible. He paweth the valley, rejoiceth in his strength, goeth on to meet the armed men. He mocketh at fear and is not affrighted, neither turneth he back from the sword. The quiver rattleth against him, the glittering spear and the shield. He swalloweth the ground with fierceness and rage, neither believeth he that is in the sound of the trumpet. He saith among the trumpets, talking about horses in battle, ha ha, and he smelleth the battle afar off, the thunder of the captains and the shouting. Doth the hawk fly by thy wisdom? Now this is a pretty straightforward question. Really straightforward. Does the hawk fly by thy wisdom? You secular humanist. Did you teach it? And stretch your wings toward the south? Doth the eagle mount up at thy command? Did we have anything to do with that? And make her nest on high? You think about what he's saying. That's just picking out two things. Horses and hawks and eagles. Hawks and birds of prey, I guess I should say, saying two things. But anyway, you look at them, and they have instinctive behavior. And the question comes, where did it come from? Now, if you're a secular humanist, you believe human beings are the smartest, most intelligent, the highest level of intelligence, there is none higher. Therefore, human beings would have to be responsible for everything, but they didn't exist, according to your theory, at the time that these things were developed. So, how did that happen? Where did that come from? I think sometimes we really, as Christians, need to be encouraged to know that we're not crazy to say that scientists can't answer all questions, because they can't. And people try to tell me to follow the science, and then I have scientists come out and say one thing today and another thing tomorrow, and then a different scientist in the afternoon say a third thing, then I know there has to be a problem. That's not scientific. That's simply that person's opinion. And you know the old saying about opinions. Your opinion's worth the same thing as mine. The answer to what they're worth in both cases would be nothing. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, I really want to read you this, because you're talking about the government of the physical universe. This physical universe is a pretty marvelous thing now, to be honest. There's no question about it. And I hear people talking about it. I even heard a scientist say on television not long ago, back when we had the hurricane that came across and just did all the destructive things down there. He said that man can solve that problem, that we can eliminate hurricanes. He's talking about climate change and how man can control it, and he can take care of it, and he can make the climate be what he wants it to be. But anyway, he's talking about that, and he's talking like we have all the answers. Let me tell you what God said by inspiration about this whole world and how it runs and why. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities is always vanity. Talking about you and I and how we look at it. He asked this question, what profit hath a man of all his labor, which he taketh under the sun? You know, man's completely dependent upon nature. He really is. He can do whatever he wants, but his life hangs in the balance. And he really is not in control of that. So he goes on to tell you how it all happened. One generation passeth away, another generation cometh, the earth abideth forever. The sun rises, the sun goeth down, hasteth the place where he rose. The wind goeth toward the south, turneth about into the north, it whirleth about continually. You ever look at a weather map, you know exactly what he's saying. The wind returneth again according to his circuits. Our weather is dictated by that, by the way. All the rivers run into the sea. I always hear people talk about we're going to run out of water in so many years. You do realize that there's the same number of gallons of water on the earth today as there was when the world was created. You do know that. And you do know that it will always be the same and that it'll just be in different forms. Either it'll be in the spring, the branch, the creek, the river, the ocean, or the clouds. That's where it's going to be. But it's always going to be the same. It never changes. He goes on and describes it for you. What man have to do with it? Nothing. Can man change it? No. The rivers run into the sea, but the sea's not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. All things are full of labor. Man cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. You know what he's saying? He's saying, we're kind of like a blind man wandering around on this earth. We make him kind of learn the house. If you've ever had Chris over your house, and he's been there a few times, Chris Peltz, he can kind of get it, learn his way around and feel around, and he can get wherever he wants to go. He can do that. That's kind of the way all men are. We've kind of been here long enough, we can kind of manipulate it. Kind of like a blind man wandering in the earth. But when it comes to changing any of those things and understanding any of those things, we kind of at a loss. Now, scientists study the weather patterns, but if man thinks for 1 minute that he's ever going to alter them and he's going to make it different than what it is, he's wrong. He can't answer that question. All these things that we think we're so smart, we're just not there. The difference between the intellect of God and the intellect of man, I don't even know how you compare that. How would you even compare that? I mean, God says the hairs of your head, the hairs of your head are numbered. God could tell you the number of hairs on your head. Now that means that I don't know how often that would change, but pretty regularly. Look at the number of hairs you see that are laying here and there that come out of your head in most people's case. That number would change, so you just have a constant running, but God could tell you. But not man. And you begin to think of that and how simple that is. And then you think of all these things he's discussing. And he's telling you, if you think that science can answer every question, they're just wrong. That's just not possible. I want to ask you a question, too, that's interesting. I've often referred to this. I've used an illustration several times. In the medical field, there are people that are psychologists, and there are people that are psychiatrists. Now, psychologists and psychiatrists, and then there are people who are brain surgeons. These psychologists and psychiatrists, they're kind of studying the mind. And I really feel sorry for them. I really do. Now, a brain surgeon's pretty simple. He goes in there and looks and he sees what's leaking and he sees the hemorrhaging and he sees the tumors and he sees the area of the brain in the case of Alzheimer's that's beginning to deteriorate, and he can understand that. He can deal with it. He can experiment with it. He can observe it. Scientifically, he can give you a lot of answers. But a poor old psychiatrist and a psychologist, what is the mind anyway? Brain's pretty easy to define. It's a big glob of fat in the top of your head, governs your whole body by the nerve endings in it. That's what a brain is, pretty simply. What's a mind? I don't know. You go find me a scientist that can answer the question of what is the mind of man. I'd like to hear that answer. I want to read you a few verses from Romans chapter 7 and 14 and 15 because he uses the word mind, and I want you to see the problem that you have. In Romans 7 and verse 23 through 25, he said this, I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind. You ever been around somebody that's hallucinating badly? I came back from Vietnam on a medical plane, and there was a fellow that was hallucinating terribly, and finally they just had to tie him up and strap him down because how are you going to deal with that? You don't know. You begin to think about the law of your mind. What is it? And he says, it brings me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members. O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of death? I thank God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with the mind, I myself serve the law of God, but with the flesh, the law of sin. Now the mind, I'd just like to hear what a definition of. I've never seen a definition. I mean, you look at a dictionary, but I got a feeling you won't be very satisfied by the answer that you have there. Now let me ask you this. Why do you think God hasn't explained that to us and told us what the mind is? Hadn't given us a great definition of that. You ever had somebody talk to you about something you don't know anything about? Maybe you go to your doctor and he gives you all this detailed information and you're sitting there thinking, why are you saying that to me? I don't know what you're talking about. I think we'd all be in that same shape if we had God trying to define for us what is the mind. I'd like for a scientist to try to define that. He really can't. It's kind of an indefinable object. But the problem is not an object. It's elusive because it can't be observed and it can't be duplicated, and we really don't know. Chapter 14, verse 5, he said, one man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. Being fully persuaded in your own mind. What is that? That's a pretty hard question to answer. Chapter 15, verse 13 through 15, he says, now the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, that you may abound in hope through the power of the Holy Ghost. And I myself also am persuaded of you, my brethren, that ye also will be full of goodness, filled with knowledge, also to admonish one another. Nevertheless, brethren, I have written the more boldly unto you, and some sort is putting you in mind, because the grace that is given to me of God. You think of a passage in the book of Philippians chapter 4 that said, the peace that passeth understanding. Maybe the mind falls into that category as well. Last question's this. The question would be this, put to a secular humanist. Why does religion exist? Why does it exist? It's kind of interesting to think about that. And what he says in Romans 1 and verse 20, when he's talking about religion, he said, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made. You know, one of the reasons that religion exists is because people with common sense walk out in the yard and see all the things that exist and all the evidence of design, and they know there's no man capable of doing that, not even a conglomeration of scientists in a think tank somewhere in Washington, D.C. could put together this universe, and we know that, and it's there. So there has to be something. Has to be. We're immediately shown that, you know, we're just like one grain of sand on the sea compared to the things that we see there. So why would we ever think that we have, as human beings, that we're in that position? No. We look at these things that are made and we see His eternal power and Godhead so that they are without excuse, because that when they knew God, they glorified Him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Maybe Romans 14 verse 1 put it best. The fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Now you think about all these questions. Just think about it. And you can think about others in your mind. Whatever your mind is. So hard to define. But you see over and over and over and over and over again that we see people trying, where a scientist is trying to deal with the question that he doesn't have a concept of. Evolution is a great example of that. Scientists can't deal with that because he can't observe it, he can't duplicate it, so he just leave it alone. It's a theory that he has, but he can't prove it. So just say, this is my opinion, ought to be yours, as a famous radio personality once said. But that's about as far as you can go. So I hope we hadn't completely wasted our time this evening. Some of you may think so. But it's just really, I've thought a lot about it. I mean, used to we had all these lessons about false religions, denominationalism and all that, and we talked about different belief systems. But we've come to a time today when the predominant belief system in the world in which we live is that human beings have all the answers, and that's just not true. And until we learn it's not true, we're going to continue to be blind, being led by the blind. Because the people that are leading us are trying to lead us from a perspective of science, but science can't deal with those issues. And we really need to think about it. You know, on the day of Pentecost, when Peter stood up and was asked the question, men and brethren, what should we do? He didn't give a scientific answer. He said, repent, be baptized for remission of sins. Can you answer that from a scientific perspective? And in fact, even ask yourself the question, what is sin? Who defines it? If there is no God. Just give it some thought and think about it. I think we need to be encouraged as Christians to realize that our belief system is not just total foolishness. That really when you look at the limitations of science, you understand there has to be a higher power than that. So we need to search for it. And we need to, once we find what that higher power is, we need to be submissive to it, realizing that man doesn't have all the answers. God does. It's not man that walks to direct his own steps, but every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God, as Jesus would say when asked the questions in the temptation. Think about it as together we stand as we sing.